The morning was quiet at the old countryside estate, a kind of quiet that almost felt like it was watching everything. The sun had just started touching the tall windows of the main house, turning the dusty glass into soft gold. The place had been under renovation for months, and workers were scattered around like busy ants, hauling tools, cutting wood, and checking plans. Among the workers and caretakers moving through the halls, there was one man who always walked quietly, almost unnoticed. People simply called him the caretaker. He didn't try to stand out, didn't try to chat or impress anyone. He just did his work, steady and calm, day after day. He kept the estate clean, carried supplies, and fixed small things that others ignored. Most people barely remembered his face by the time they walked past him. That morning, he stepped into the music room with a small cloth in his hand. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Dust floated in the thin air like little stars. The grand piano sat in the center of the room, covered in a faded sheet that no longer fitted properly. The caretaker slowly pulled the sheet off, folded it neatly, and placed it on a chair. He wiped the piano gently, tracing the curved edges with quiet care. He didn't play a single note, not one key. He only cleaned it. He always treated the piano that way, like something important, something alive. Even though no one else really came to this room anymore. But on this particular morning, someone else did. A sound of loud footsteps echoed down the hallway. Confident steps. Steps of someone who expected the world to make room for him wherever he went. The caretaker lifted his head for a moment, then looked back at the piano. A group of people entered the room, led by a man in a sharp suit. He was tall, well-fed, and carried himself like someone used to giving orders. His watch alone looked like it cost more than most people earned in a month. His name was known to everyone who worked on the estate, even if many had never spoken to him directly. The millionaire owner of the property. He had arrived unannounced, which wasn't unusual. He enjoyed showing up randomly, partly to check progress, and partly to remind everyone that everything in sight belonged to him. When he saw the caretaker standing by the piano, he smirked. "There you are," he said loudly, almost as if the caretaker had been hiding from him. "I've been told you're the one fussing with this old piano every morning." The caretaker didn't shift or shrink back. He simply nodded. "I just keep it clean, sir." The millionaire stepped closer to the piano and tapped it with the back of his finger, like he was checking if it was real wood. "You know," he said, "this thing is older than everyone in this room. I bought it at an auction years ago. Been sitting here collecting dust ever since." He glanced at the caretaker again. "Do you play?" he asked. The caretaker shook his head politely. "I only clean it." "Only clean it," the millionaire repeated, pretending to think about it. "Well, that makes sense. You don't look like someone who'd know what to do with a piano." His tone made several of the guests snicker. The caretaker didn't react. Not even a blink. The millionaire leaned on the edge of the piano, enjoying the attention he was getting from his guests. "You know what? Let's have a little fun this morning," he said. "It's been a boring day so far." He pointed at the caretaker, the way someone might point at a child during a game. "If you can play even one decent tune on this thing," the millionaire said, his voice filled with exaggeration, "I'll marry you right here." Immediately, his friends burst into laughter. The joke wasn't clever, but they laughed anyway, because he was wealthy. And wealthy people rarely heard silence after a joke. The caretaker simply stood still. One of the guests added, "Come on, play us something. Anything. We need entertainment." "He's serious." Of course he wasn't serious. Everyone knew it was a joke. A way to show off. A way to turn a simple caretaker into a prop for his audience. The millionaire waved his hand dramatically. "Go on, play. Impress us." But the caretaker didn't move an inch. He only gave a small, polite smile, the kind that showed he wasn't offended, but also wasn't planning to join their game. "I don't know how to play," he repeated softly. His voice was calm. No fear, no frustration, just honesty. The millionaire rolled his eyes. "Of course you don't." Then he looked around at the others. "See? I told you. These people can barely mop a floor, let alone play a piano." A few of the workers standing outside the door lowered their eyes, pretending they hadn't heard. The caretaker didn't seem bothered. He simply picked up his cloth again, but the millionaire wasn't finished. No, don't walk away," he said, lifting a hand. "I'm not done enjoying this." He walked around the piano and sat on the bench, pressing a random key with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed breaking things. The note rang out loud and sharp. "See?" he said, looking at the caretaker. "This is what a piano sounds like. In case you didn't know." More laughter. The caretaker simply nodded again, showing nothing on his face. The millionaire leaned forward. "Honestly, this piano might as well be firewood for how useless it is now. Unless," his eyes narrowed mischievously, "unless our friend here suddenly surprises us." His tone made it clear he didn't believe that would ever happen. The caretaker took a small step back from the piano, not because of fear, but because he didn't want trouble. He had experienced people like this before, loud, proud, restless people who spoke just to hear themselves talk. He knew how to handle them, quietly, simply, with no arguments. "I should get back to work," the caretaker said. "Work?" The millionaire scoffed. "Yes, wiping dust is very important." He didn't give the caretaker permission to leave, but the caretaker gently turned away anyway. One of the millionaire's friends called out, "Come on, lighten up. It's just a joke." But for the caretaker, it wasn't the joke that bothered him. It was the wastefulness of the moment. The way people who already had everything felt the need to take a piece of someone who had nothing. He walked toward the door. His steps were soft, steady, but the millionaire wasn't satisfied. Jokes weren't fun for him unless they had an audience, and unless the person being laughed at reacted. "Wait," he said loudly. "Don't go yet. I want you to hear something." The caretaker paused. He didn't turn around at first. After a long second, he looked back. The millionaire began tapping random keys again, each one sharper and more unpleasant than the last. "This is what music sounds like to you, isn't it?" he said. "Just noise?" His guests chuckled politely. But something interesting happened then. The caretaker stepped forward, not toward the millionaire, but toward a corner of the room, where a forgotten cabinet stood. He picked up a small feather duster from the top of it and began cleaning a dusty picture frame on the wall. He didn't look bothered, didn't look upset, didn't look hurt. He simply continued doing what he always did, his job. For some reason, that made the millionaire even more amused. "Look at him," one guest whispered. "He doesn't react at all." "That's because he's used to being ordered around," another said. The millionaire gave a fake thoughtful look. "Maybe he's shy. Maybe he's secretly a musical genius and just too humble to show us." He laughed loudly at his own. Joke. The caretaker didn't lift his eyes from the picture frame. It was an old photograph of a music gathering from decades ago, musicians, instruments, and smiling faces. The caretaker stared at it for a brief moment longer than he needed to, then gently finished dusting it. He put the duster down and turned back to the room. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked quietly. His voice was steady, neither annoyed nor submissive. The millionaire waved his hand. "No, you can go. We've had enough entertainment." The caretaker nodded once, then walked out of the room. The millionaire watched him leave with a satisfied grin, as if he had won some kind of competition. But a few of the workers standing outside didn't laugh. One of them whispered, "He didn't deserve that." Another worker said, "He never bothers anyone. Why treat him like that?" The millionaire didn't hear those comments. Even if he had, they wouldn't have mattered to him. He had money. He had power. And he believed that gave him the right to make jokes at anyone's expense. As the caretaker walked down the hallway, he let out a slow breath. Not a sigh of sadness. Not anger. Just breath. He had learned long ago that people often showed their true selves when they didn't think anyone was watching. Some showed kindness. Others showed pride. And some, like the millionaire, used their power as a toy. Still, something about the piano room lingered in the caretaker's mind. Not because of the mockery, but because of the piano itself. He paused near a window where the sunlight fell across the floor in warm strips. For a moment, he closed his eyes. A faint memory tried to rise fingers on keys. A melody, a crowd, but he pushed it away gently. The way someone might close a book they weren't ready to open. He walked on. Behind him, the millionaire laughed again, loud and carefree. The sound followed him down the hall. But he didn't let it settle anywhere inside him, because he knew the truth, and the truth had a way of revealing itself when the time was right. The afternoon sun drifted across the estate like a slow-moving spotlight, warming the brick walls and stretching long shadows across the paths. Workers continued their tasks outside, sanding wooden railings, painting fences, and carrying bags of cement. Inside the house, though, things felt strangely calm after the morning's odd scene in the music room. The caretaker walked through the long hallway with his usual quiet steps. He carried a small toolbox in one hand and a folded cloth in the other. He wasn't thinking about the millionaire's joke anymore. He had heard worse. People who didn't know him always assumed he was simple or silent, or someone who had never lived a life beyond chores and cleaning. But he didn't mind what they thought. Not really. What mattered was that the day moved forward, and there was always work to be done. He reached the storage room at the back of the house, where cleaning supplies were stacked in tall shelves. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and old cardboard. He placed his tools gently on a table and looked around to see what needed restocking. As he did, two of the workers came in through the side door. They didn't notice him at first. They were too busy talking. "Did you see what happened earlier?" One of them said. "How could I not?" The other replied, "He was loud enough for the whole county to hear." They both chuckled awkwardly. The caretaker continued organizing supplies without looking up, though their voices drifted clearly through the room. "Honestly," one of them added, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might hear, "I don't know why he talks to people like that. The caretaker never does anything to bother him." "Some people tease because they're bored," the other said, "or because they think money gives them permission." They finally noticed the caretaker nearby. One of the men rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. "Oh, hey," he said softly. "Didn't see you there." The caretaker gave a small smile. "It's all right." Both workers exchanged a look, then walked over. "Sorry you had to deal with that this morning," one said. "You didn't deserve it." The caretaker shook his head. "It wasn't important." "But still," the second worker insisted, "he shouldn't talk to people like that." The caretaker didn't respond right away. He simply folded a cloth and placed it neatly in a drawer. "It's fine," he said at last, calm as ever. "Some things don't need a reaction." The workers nodded, even though they didn't really understand how he stayed so peaceful. Most people would have been angry. They would have snapped back or walked out or complained. But the caretaker had a quiet strength that made anger feel almost unnecessary. After a few more minutes of helping the workers sort tools, he stepped out of the storage room and went back into the hallway. The house was large, filled with long corridors and echoing floors. and it was easy to get lost if you didn't know the place well. But the caretaker moved through it like someone who knew the rhythm of every door and the sound of every window latch. He reached one of the smaller lounges, where an old rug covered the floor and the air smelled like mint from the nearby garden. He knelt down to tighten a loose screw on a vent, humming softly under his breath. It wasn't a real song, just a wandering tune, almost like someone searching for a melody. As he worked, a soft voice came from behind him. "You always hum when you're fixing something." He turned and saw one of the house staff standing at the doorway, holding a clipboard. She was older, gentle, and one of the few people who treated everyone the same, no matter their job. He smiled lightly. "I didn't realize I was humming." "You always do," she said with a warm nod. "It's a nice sound, actually. Makes the house feel less empty." He nodded politely and returned to his task. She stepped farther into the room. "I heard about what happened earlier, by the way. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said, not looking up. You know, he wasn't really serious about that offer. "I know," he answered. She hesitated. It was still rude. The caretaker tightened the final screw and closed his toolbox. "Some people talk to hear their own voices," he said simply. "It doesn't mean I have to listen closely." The woman stared at him for a moment, surprised by his calmness. "You're a good man," she said. "You don't let things change who you are." He nodded gently, though he didn't say anything in return. Compliments weren't something he was comfortable with. They felt heavy, like coats he didn't know how to wear. She gave him a kind smile and left the room. When she was gone, the caretaker sat on the floor for a quiet moment, resting his hands on his knees. The room felt peaceful. The sunlight warmed the rug. The air smelled fresh, and somewhere outside, birds chattered loudly from a tree. But a faint thought crept into his mind. The piano. He hadn't expected the millionaire to pick that room today. That room he usually cleaned when no one was around. That room where he tried not to linger, but always found himself staring at the piano for a moment longer than necessary. He stood up slowly and picked up his toolbox. He had other tasks to finish, but his steps took him almost without thinking toward the upper floor. There were fewer workers on the second level. Most of the rooms they were used for storage, or left untouched because the millionaire rarely visited them. The hallway was long and quiet, with old portraits lining the walls. People from decades past, standing stiffly with instruments, books, or polished shoes. The caretaker slowed as he passed each portrait. He always did, not because he recognized the faces, but because the paintings calmed him. They reminded him of something familiar, though he couldn't quite place what. He stopped in front of one portrait in particular. A man stood in the picture, holding a violin, his head slightly bowed, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The caretaker studied the man's hands, his posture, the way he held the instrument with both firmness and gentleness. Something inside him stirred. He turned away before the feeling grew stronger. At the far end of the corridor, he found a door that needed fixing. The latch had been sticking for weeks. He knelt down and opened his toolbox again. As he adjusted the metal hinges, his mind wandered not to the millionaire, not to the staff, not even to the morning's laughter. His thoughts drifted to a time long before the estate, a time when the world was different, when noise didn't overwhelm him but guided him, when crowds didn't frighten him but welcomed him. He pushed the memory away gently. Some memories were like old songs, beautiful but painful when listened to closely. When the latch finally clicked smoothly into place, he stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. The hallway felt warmer than before, and the sunlight had shifted. Leaving golden squares on the floor. He made his way back downstairs. As he reached the bottom step, he saw a few guests standing near the main entrance, preparing to leave. They were the same people who had laughed with the millionaire earlier. They carried bags and coats, still talking loudly. One of them noticed the caretaker passing by. "There he is," the guest said, nudging another. "Our quiet piano cleaner." The caretaker simply nodded politely. "Maybe he'll take use up on the challenge next time," another guest joked. They laughed again, but the first guest squinted at him thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "there was something about the way you stood by that piano today. Almost like you knew it better than any of us did." The caretaker felt a small tightening in his chest, but said nothing. The guest shrugged and turned back to the group. "Whatever. Let's go. I'm starving." They walked out of the house, their laughter fading behind them. The caretaker remained still for a moment. The echo of their voices lingered in the large entrance hall. He looked up at the balcony, railing above him, where shadows danced softly from the afternoon light. He wasn't angry at them. He wasn't bothered, but something inside him felt like it was shifting. Like a door he had kept closed for a long time was starting to loosen. He turned and headed toward the back of the house, where the garden door was slightly open. A breeze flowed in, carrying the smell of grass and soil. Outside, a few workers were trimming hedges and repairing a broken fountain. The caretaker set his toolbox on a bench and joined them. One of the workers handed him a pair of gloves. "Mind helping me move this stone piece?" "Of course," the caretaker replied. They lifted the heavy piece together, placing it carefully where it belonged. "You're stronger than you look," the worker joked. The caretaker smiled faintly. "Work keeps the body steady." As the afternoon slowly faded, he moved from task to task, helping wherever he was needed. He trimmed branches, carried buckets of water, swept fallen leaves, and tightened loose bolts on the fountain structure. But every now and then, his mind drifted back to the piano room, to the keys he never touched, to the sound he hadn't allowed himself to make in years. And when the sun finally slipped behind the trees, painting the sky with soft orange light, he found himself standing beside the garden wall, staring at the distant windows of the music room. A quiet whisper of memory fluttered inside him, light, gentle, persistent. He closed his eyes. For a moment he let it come. A melody, faint but familiar, drifted through his mind like a warm breeze. Then he opened his eyes again. The day was ending. There was still work to do tomorrow. He picked up his tools and walked toward the caretaker's shed as the estate settled into a peaceful evening. But something had changed, and though no one else could see it, the caretaker felt it like the soft shift of a tide. A change that would matter soon. The next morning began quietly, as if the estate itself was waking slowly, stretching its old walls and dusty corners. A soft fog hugged the trees outside, rolling across the garden and drifting through the open pathways. The air felt cool and gentle, like it was preparing everyone for something calmer than the day before. The caretaker walked across the yard with a basket of cleaning cloths and a small broom. His steps were steady, unhurried. He greeted a few of the workers with a nod, though he spoke very little. Talking had never been his way of welcoming a day. Silence felt more honest, more peaceful. Inside the house, he began his usual tasks, dusting the stair rail, sweeping the hallway corners, collecting empty cups left behind by visitors. Everything was simple, predictable, easy to breathe through. But even as he worked, a strange feeling rested quietly in the back of his mind. A small pull. A faint echo, the piano. Every time his thoughts drifted, they drifted there. He tried to ignore it, to stay focused on the tasks at hand, but something in him felt unsettled. Not in a bad way, more like something that had been asleep for a long time was beginning to stir. By mid-morning, he found himself standing outside the music room door without meaning to. He hadn't planned to go there. He hadn't chosen it consciously. His feet had simply led him. The door was slightly open, letting out a stream of warm light from inside. He stared at the space between the door and the frame. His chest tightened just a little. He pushed the door open gently. The room looked the same as always. Dust floating in the light, shelves filled with sheet music no one read anymore, faded curtains framing the tall windows. And in the center, the grand piano stood quietly, waiting, like it had been expecting him. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just stared at the piano, its smooth surface, its polished keys, its silent promise. He approached it slowly, almost cautiously. He placed his cleaning basket down on the floor and ran a soft cloth across the top, brushing away a thin layer of dust. His fingers moved with gentle care, but they trembled ever so slightly. He didn't understand why today felt different. Maybe it was the memory from yesterday. Maybe it was the laughter echoing in his mind. Not because it hurt him, but because it reminded him of something he had left behind, something he once loved, something he once lived. He took a quiet breath. Another dot, his hand hovered above the keys dot just inches away, but he pulled it back quickly, as if the air around the keyboard was too warm, too alive. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He stepped back, rubbed his palms together, and told himself he had to finish cleaning. That was his job. That was why he was here. Not for anything more. He dusted the shelves, polished the bench legs, wiped the window frames. But no matter where he moved, the piano felt like it was watching him, not waiting, that he tried not to look at it. But his eyes drifted back again, and again, not at one point. He found himself standing directly behind the bench, staring down at the keys from above. The fog outside the window had lifted, letting soft sunlight fill the room and spill across the keyboard. The white keys glowed gently, and the black keys looked like slivers of quiet shadow. He whispered under his breath, "Not now." But it didn't change the way the room felt. It felt like a moment asking for something. Like the universe had paused for him to take one small step he had been avoiding for years. Before he could decide what to do, a voice came from the doorway. "There you are." He turned sharply. The same older staff member from yesterday stood at the door with a small stack of papers in her hands. "I thought you might be in here," she said with a gentle smile. "You always end up here at some point?" He cleared his throat lightly. "Just cleaning." "Of course," she said, stepping further inside. "You take better care of this room than anyone else does. Sometimes I think you keep it alive." He looked down at the bench. His fingers brushed the back of it softly. She watched him for a moment. "You know, you don't have to pretend you don't like this room. I see the way you look at the piano." He felt his heart skip a beat. She wasn't judging, only observing. She had always been kind, always gentle, but her words still felt sharp in their truth. "I only look," he said quietly. "Looking can mean a lot," she replied. He didn't answer. She stepped beside him and placed the papers on a small table. "I'll leave you to your work," she said softly. "But don't be afraid to touch the keys. It's not a crime." She gave a small smile. "And I doubt the piano would complain." With that, she walked out and closed the door gently behind her. The caretaker stood frozen for a long moment. Touched the keys. The idea felt too big, too heavy. He wasn't afraid of the piano. He was afraid of what it would awaken inside him. He took a step back, then another, but he didn't leave. Instead, he slowly walked to the windows and drew the curtains slightly, letting light fall across the room in softer streaks. He sat on the small stool in the corner and closed his eyes, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. The room was full of memories. He hadn't spoken aloud in years. Memories of concert halls, early mornings filled with scales and practice, people clapping, people cheering, people watching. He had left that life behind for reasons no one at the estate knew, reasons he rarely allowed himself to revisit. But the piano had always been patient, Dot. It had waited silently for him, the way old friends sometimes do. He felt his breath shaking. Finally, almost without realizing he was moving, he stood up and walked toward the piano again. He sat slowly on the bench, his hands resting on his lap. Dot. The keys were inches from his fingers. He leaned forward a little, his breath brushing the edge of the keyboard. Dot. Then, gently, he pressed one key. A single note rang through the room. Dot. Soft, Dot. Warm, Dot. Alive. Dot. The sound seemed to echo not only off the walls, but deep inside him. He pressed another key. Dot. Then another. Dot. And suddenly, without planning, without thinking, he played a short, simple phrase. Just a few notes, just enough to feel familiar. He stopped quickly afterward, pulling his hands back as though he had stepped into water that was too deep. He stood up so fast, the bench squeaked across the floor. Dot. His heart pounded. He wasn't ready. Not for the music, not for what it brought with it. He stepped away from the piano, running a hand across his face. He needed air. He walked to the window and pushed it open, letting the cool breeze hit his skin. Outside, the workers were busy repairing the fountain again. Hammers tapped, voices called back and forth, tools clattered. The real world hummed with its usual familiar sounds. He let the fresh air calm him. After a minute, he closed the window and turned back toward the piano. He approached it slowly, like someone approaching an old friend they weren't sure they were ready to talk to again. He placed a cloth gently over the keys. Then he whispered softly, "Not yet." He turned away. Just as he reached the door, it opened suddenly. The millionaire stepped inside. Dot. Not with the loud laughter from the day before, but with a curious look on his face. "Ah," he said, "there you are. I had a feeling you'd be in this room again." The caretaker stiffened slightly, but kept his composure. The millionaire walked toward him, hands in his pockets. "You know, I've been thinking about yesterday. That little challenge I gave you." He grinned. "Quite a moment, wasn't it? My friends loved it." The caretaker didn't speak. The millionaire looked past him at the piano. "It really is a beautiful instrument," he said. "Shame it never gets played." The caretaker said quietly, "Some things don't need attention to have value." The millionaire raised an eyebrow. "You speak in strange ways, you know that?" He laughed lightly. "If you really can play, though, you should have shown us. Could have been fun." "I don't play," the caretaker replied calmly. The millionaire walked closer to the piano and tapped a key with his finger. "Well, I'm hosting a small gathering tomorrow evening. A few guests, some drinks, a bit of music. Perhaps you'll entertain us then?" The caretaker shook his head immediately. "That's not something I can do." The millionaire shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if you ever decide to show off, do it when I'm around. I enjoy surprises." He smirked, "especially when they come from people who look so ordinary." The caretaker didn't respond. The millionaire took one last look around the room, patted the top of the piano like he was patting a dog, and walked out without another word. Dot. The door clicked shut behind him. The caretaker stayed still for a long time. His pulse was still rapid from earlier, but now something else mixed with it, frustration maybe, or fear, or both. He sat slowly on the bench again, though he didn't touch the keys. He looked at the piano with soft, troubled eyes. Then he whispered to himself, "Why now? Why after all this time?" He didn't know the answer, but he knew something important. The music he had locked away inside him for years was no longer silent. It was waiting. And sooner or later, he would have to face it. For now, though, he stood, picked up his basket, and left the room quietly. The piano sat alone again. Dot silent dot, but not. Forgotten dot, not anymore. The moment the caretaker sat at the piano, the entire room seemed to pause. People who had been talking loudly over drinks slowly lowered their voices. A few even stepped closer, curious to see what he would do. He looked calm, almost too calm for someone who had been mocked only minutes earlier. His hands rested lightly on his knees for a moment, as if he were simply collecting a quiet thought. Then, without looking nervous or unsure, he placed his fingers gently on the keys. The millionaire leaned back in his chair with a wide grin. He clearly expected nothing. To him, this was nothing more than a joke that he believed would amuse the guests. Some of them giggled softly, waiting for the caretaker to struggle or press the wrong keys, or maybe even give up completely. But the caretaker did not rush. He took a slow breath, and that simple action changed the room somehow. It was as if he had claimed the space without saying a single word. His first notes were soft, almost too soft to catch if the room had still been loud. But because a hush had already fallen, the delicate sound lifted into the air clearly. The notes were gentle but smooth, like something carefully placed instead of forced. No one expected that. A few guests leaned forward, their eyebrows lifting in surprise. The millionaire's smile began to slip, though he tried to hold it. The caretaker's fingers moved again, this time with more certainty. The melody grew stronger, shaping into something meaningful and beautiful. It wasn't loud or dramatic yet. It was simple, heartfelt, and clear, the kind of music that made people listen without knowing why. His shoulders stayed relaxed, and his face showed no sign of effort. To him, the keys were not an obstacle. They were an old friend. Someone in the back whispered, "He can really play." Another person hushed them quickly. Not wanting to disturb the growing magic in the room, the caretaker shifted slightly, letting the melody swell. And then something changed. His hands, which had been moving slowly and gently, suddenly danced with a speed and confidence that made several guests gasp. What had started as a quiet tune rose into something so powerful that the room felt smaller, as though every breath, every thought was being pulled toward the piano. The caretaker's fingers flew across, the keys with precision that seemed nearly impossible. The high notes sparkled, the deeper notes rolled like distant thunder. It was not just skill. It was passion, a feeling so real that even people who had never cared about music could sense it. The millionaire's jaw loosened. His eyes widened as he stared, unable to believe what he was hearing. For many of the guests, this was the first time in their lives they had seen someone play at that level up close. They had heard recordings, watched performances online, maybe even gone to concerts. But this felt different. There was something raw and honest about it, something that seemed to reach past the eyes and ears and land directly in the heart. The caretaker played a section, where the left hand carried a deep, rolling pattern while the right hand soared above it with fast, high notes. Anyone who knew even a little about piano could see how difficult that was, but even those who didn't know could feel the intensity. It was like watching two different people play two different songs that somehow blended into one perfect piece. Guests exchanged looks of disbelief. One woman pressed a hand to her chest, moved by something she could not name. A man who had earlier laughed at the caretaker's quiet nature now stood frozen, his drink forgotten in his hand. Then the caretaker shifted again, easing the music into a softer moment. The sound melted into something gentle and fragile, like a memory turning warm. It felt personal, almost as if he were telling a story without words, a story no one else had known he carried. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes while playing, letting his hands guide him without sight. The room held its breath. No one dared to interrupt. No one even seemed to blink. The millionaire, once so sure of himself, looked around quickly as if hoping someone else could explain what was happening. He had expected a simple tune, maybe even a failure. Instead, he was witnessing something extraordinary, something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As the caretaker opened his eyes again, the music shifted into a new style. It carried traces of classical pieces, but also something unique. It was as if he were blending parts of who he had been in his past with who he was now. There was strength in the sound, and sadness and hope, all mixed together in a way that made listeners' throats tighten unexpectedly. One of the guests whispered to another, "This isn't normal. People train their whole lives to play like this." The caretaker's hands then burst into a bright, rushing section that swept across the keys like a storm. It wasn't just fast, it was controlled, expressive, full of emotion. Every note was clean, every movement precise, yet filled with a depth that made the room feel smaller and the moment feel larger. The millionaire's shoulders lowered as if he had been pushed back by the sound itself. The confidence he had walked in with, the certainty that money, status, and power made him untouchable, seemed to fade. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. The caretaker was. And not because he had demanded it, but because his talent left no other choice. The caretaker slowed down again, letting the music breathe. The soft notes felt like a gentle breeze after a storm. People blinked and swallowed, some realizing that they had been holding their breath for too long. His playing felt like a conversation with the room, a quiet, kind, honest conversation. He moved into the final section, letting the melody return to the gentle theme he had begun with. It felt like coming home, like closing a chapter that had been opened long ago. His fingers softened until the last note hung in the air quietly, fading slowly like a whisper. The room remained silent for several heartbeats. No one knew what to say or do. It was as if they needed time to return to themselves after being taken somewhere else entirely. Finally, someone exhaled sharply, breaking the stillness. Then the entire room seemed to come back to life. People swallowed, blinked, looked around at each other with stunned expressions. A few guests had tears in their eyes without fully understanding why. The millionaire's hands lowered to the sides of his chair. He looked almost small now, nothing like the man who had mocked the caretaker earlier. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him at first. When he tried again, it was softer than anyone expected. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked quietly, though part of him seemed afraid to hear the answer. The caretaker simply gave a small, humble smile. He didn't answer, not yet. The room was still too full of emotion, and he didn't seem interested in taking attention for himself. Instead, he stood slowly, giving a respectful nod to the stunned audience. Then he stepped away from the piano, as calmly as he had approached it. The millionaire's guests stared at him, waiting for him to say something, but he could not find the right words. Everything he had believed about the caretaker had been wrong. And deep down, he knew this performance had changed something not just in the room, but inside him as well. But the caretaker wasn't thinking about the millionaire's pride. He walked away quietly, slipping out of the center of attention the same way he had lived each day, with humility, calmness, and a quiet strength that no one had understood until now. And though he had played like a genius, he left the room as softly as a whisper, letting the echo of his music speak for him long after he was gone. The room was still buzzing quietly from the caretaker's performance when the door near the back opened, and one of the guests hurried inside. She had stepped out earlier to take a phone call, but the moment she heard the last notes drifting through the hallway, she rushed back in. She looked around with a confused expression, trying to understand why everyone appeared stunned. The others were too lost in their own thoughts to explain anything. Some were whispering in disbelief, while others simply stared at the piano as if it had come alive. But one man among the crowd, a journalist who had come as someone's guest, was staring not at the piano, but at the caretaker who was quietly slipping toward the exit. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. He had seen that face before. Not here, not in a grand estate, and certainly not dressed in simple work clothes. He had seen the caretaker's face years earlier, on a magazine cover. He moved toward the millionaire, who was still trying to gather himself. The journalist hesitated only for a moment, then leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "I think I know who he is." The millionaire blinked, as if waking from a dream. "What do you mean?" The journalist took a moment to choose his words. "He used to perform on big stages. Not as an adult, he was young. Very young. A prodigy." The millionaire stared at him, not sure whether to believe it. But something about the caretaker's playing his mastery, his confidence, his way of letting the music speak for him, made the journalist's words feel more than possible. They felt true. "Are you telling me he was famous?" The millionaire asked, confused and embarrassed at the idea. Not in a loud, celebrity way, the journalist replied softly. "More like respected, admired by musicians. He was considered one of the brightest young talents of his time." The guests nearby overheard enough to turn their heads. Eyes widened. Some exchanged shocked glances as pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "But I don't understand," someone whispered. "Why would someone like that end up working here?" No one had an answer. Not yet. While the room filled with soft murmurs, the caretaker stepped quietly through a side door and down a long hall. He wasn't trying to flee. He simply didn't like being the center of attention. He had lived quietly for too long to want applause now. He headed toward the back garden, where tall hedges shielded the grounds from the noise of the estate. He liked this area more than anywhere else. The earth was soft, the air calm, and the plants didn't ask questions. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air. The sky was slowly turning orange as the sun began to lower. He hoped the guests would forget the moment and return to their conversations soon, but footsteps approached. He turned and saw the journalist walking toward him, not quickly, not aggressively, but carefully, as if afraid to disrupt something fragile. "May I speak with you?" The journalist asked gently. The caretaker hesitated. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to nod or shake his head. But finally he gave a small nod. The journalist came closer, keeping a respectful distance. He studied the caretaker's face with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "I know who you are," he said softly. The caretaker didn't react. No surprise. No fear. Just a calm acceptance, like someone who had expected this possibility someday. "You were extraordinary even as a child," the journalist continued. "Your performances? People talked about them with such respect. They said you didn't just play music, you transformed it." The caretaker looked away at the horizon. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "That was a long time ago." The journalist nodded. "I'm not here to pry. I want to understand. Why did you disappear? One day you were everywhere, and then suddenly you are gone. No explanation." The caretaker's fingers brushed a leaf on a nearby bush. He didn't speak right away. When he finally found his voice, it carried a quiet weight. "My family needed peace. There were too many expectations. Too much pressure. The world—" He paused, searching for a simple way to say something complicated. "The world wanted more from me than I could give. And when life became difficult, I didn't have the strength to keep performing." The journalist listened without interrupting. "I lost people," the caretaker continued softly. "People I loved. After that, the music didn't feel like freedom anymore. It felt like a cage filled with memories I wasn't ready to face." The journalist lowered his head slightly, understanding. It wasn't the kind of story that needed details. The emotion itself told enough. "So you walked away," the journalist said gently. The caretaker nodded. "I wanted a quiet life, a simple one. I didn't want fame." I didn't want stages. I just wanted to breathe without being watched. And now you're working as a caretaker, the journalist said. You chose this life? I chose peace, the caretaker replied. And this place, it gave me that? The journalist looked at him with respect. You played today with the heart of someone who still carries music inside them, even if they tried to leave it behind. The caretaker gave a small, humble smile. I didn't play for the guests. I didn't play for the millionaire. I played because someone challenged me, and I thought it would end quickly. I didn't expect. He looked back toward the estate. I didn't expect it to become all that. The journalist nodded again. There was nothing more to ask, no pressure to tell more. He had gotten the truth he came for, and it was enough. I won't write about this, he said quietly. Your story is yours, not something for headlines. The caretaker turned back toward him with gratitude in his eyes. Thank you. The journalist gave a polite nod and walked back toward the house, leaving the caretaker alone again. Meanwhile, inside the estate, the millionaire remained seated, staring at the piano with a look that was far from his usual confidence. He felt something he wasn't used to feeling: shame. Not because he had been wrong about the caretaker, but because he had mocked him for amusement. He remembered how he had laughed earlier, how he had treated the caretaker as someone beneath him. And yet, the caretaker had shown a strength that money could never buy. One of the guests approached him cautiously. Are you all right? The millionaire shook his head slowly. I've been a fool, he muttered. The guests didn't disagree, though they chose not to say it aloud. As the whispers spread, more and more people came to understand that the caretaker's past was filled with talent, loss, and sacrifice. He wasn't a mystery anymore. He was a person who had chosen peace over fame. Some guests felt moved. Others felt humbled. A few felt guilty for the jokes they had made earlier in the day. The caretaker returned inside later, hoping to slip past unnoticed. But the room grew quiet the moment he stepped in. People turned, not with mockery, but with a new kind of respect, quiet, gentle, sincere. He felt uncomfortable with it, but he didn't show it. He simply nodded at those who stood closest and continued walking. The millionaire stood up suddenly. I owe you an apology, he said loudly. The room fell silent. The caretaker paused and turned, not expecting the public moment. The millionaire took a step forward, his posture no longer proud or towering. His voice shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of humility. I mocked you without knowing anything about you. I spoke to you as if you were small, when the truth is, I was the small one. I judged you, and I treated you unfairly. The caretaker listened quietly. You have more talent in your hands than I have in all the things I own, the millionaire continued, and you carry yourself with more dignity than I've ever shown. I'm sorry for the way I acted. The caretaker held his gaze for a moment, then gave a calm nod. It's all right, he said softly. People see what they want to see. You didn't know me. Now you do. The millionaire swallowed, relieved and yet still ashamed. I hope, the millionaire said, that you won't leave because of me. The caretaker shook his head. I'm not going anywhere. The billionaire nodded gratefully. But deep inside, everyone in the room knew the truth. After what had happened tonight, nothing about this estate would ever feel quite the same again. For the rest of the evening, the estate felt different. Not louder or quieter, just changed in a way no one could fully describe. People moved around with softer steps, spoke in calmer voices, and kept glancing toward the piano as if expecting it to suddenly begin playing again on its own. The caretaker's performance lingered like a warm light in the air, impossible to shake off. He tried to continue with his normal tasks, but it was clear that nothing would be normal tonight. Wherever he walked, someone paused to look at him, with respect, with curiosity, or with quiet admiration. He didn't ask for this attention. He didn't want it. Yet he accepted it with the same calmness he carried in every part of his life. But the millionaire's thoughts were a storm. He kept replaying the music in his mind, the effortless way. The caretaker's hands moved, the emotion in every note, the change it created in the room. And then he replayed his own words from earlier, the careless mockery, the boastful jokes. Each time the memory surfaced, he felt another heavy wave of embarrassment. He had spent his life in control in business, in social circles, in conversations. But tonight, control had slipped from his hands the moment the caretaker touched the keys. It humbled him in a way he had never experienced. Later that evening, as guests began settling into quieter conversations, the millionaire stepped out onto the back veranda. Lantern lights flickered gently overhead, casting warm glows across the garden. He wasn't looking for anyone, but he found the caretaker there, standing near the railing and gazing out at the darkening sky. He hesitated before approaching. The caretaker noticed him, but didn't turn fully. He simply acknowledged him with a small nod. "May I join you?" The millionaire asked gently. "Yes," the caretaker said. The millionaire stood beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The night air was cool, and the sound of distant crickets filled the silence. After a while, the millionaire let out a breath. "I've been thinking about everything that happened tonight," he began softly. "And about how I behaved earlier." The caretaker didn't interrupt. "I was wrong," the millionaire continued. "I judged you without knowing who you were, without even caring to know. I spoke as if being wealthy made me better than you. But you showed me something I can't ignore." The caretaker finally looked at him, not with anger or pride, but with patience. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. The millionaire shook his head. "I owe you respect and an apology. And I've given you both, but it doesn't feel like enough. You changed something inside me tonight, more than you know." The caretaker didn't respond immediately. He turned his gaze back toward the sky. "I didn't come here to change anyone," he said softly. "I came here to live quietly, to keep my heart steady, to find peace in the simple parts of life." The millionaire nodded, listening. "You found it?" he asked. The caretaker gave a slow nod. "Yes, in work, in silence, in staying out of sight." The millionaire swallowed. "Then tonight disrupted that for you." The caretaker's voice remained gentle. Not in a bad way, just unexpected. They stood quietly for another moment. Finally, the millionaire spoke again. "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" "The music, the stages, the life you had before." The caretaker thought for a long moment. "I miss the music," he said, "not the stages. Not the pressure, not the attention, just the music." The millionaire nodded slowly. "Would you ever play again?" "Not for fame, not for crowds. Just for yourself." The caretaker smiled faintly. "I never stopped. I only stopped sharing it." The millionaire looked at him with quiet respect. "I hope someday you'll share it again with people who appreciate it. Not because they expect it, but because they would be grateful for it." The caretaker didn't answer. He simply let the thoughts settle, like a leaf drifting onto calm water far inside the estate. Voices rose again, still gentle, but filled with curiosity. A guest approached the veranda and stopped a few steps away. "They're asking about you," she said to the caretaker. "Not to bother you. They just want to thank you. Your playing touched them." The caretaker looked mildly uncomfortable, though he hid it politely. The millionaire turned toward him. "You don't owe them a perf.